Hi, everybody. Today's October 30, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me Professor Paul Manger. Paul is a fascinating man with a fascinating theory. It's going to rock your world because everyone loves dolphins. We all love whales, and they're cute and brilliant or not. Paul, tell us about yourself and your interests on cetaceans.
Hi, Randall. Well, thanks for having me come to talk with you. So I'm a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. I'm originally from Australia. I've worked on lots of different animals over my career. I've been in South Africa for about 21 years now. And I work a lot on the brains of different animals, just trying to understand what's going on there with the different animals. I'm really a neuroanatomist at heart. So I look at things, find different things with the neuroanatomy, and then try to figure out what that means for the animal's life and for their behavior. And a long time ago, I had this very unusual meeting with a professor in Russia, in Moscow, through a friend. And she knew that I enjoyed working on the brains of different animals. And she said, look, why are dolphins and whales not so smart? And I was sort of taken aback at first by this. And she went on and explained a lot of her behavioral work that showed that most animals could do a lot of different complex behavioral tasks, but the whales and dolphins were really having problems. And she kind of challenged me to find out why if they have such big brains, are they not so intelligent?
Well, size matters, right?
Yes and no. It depends. It depends on what it is. This is the biggest problem with overcoming the idea about whales and dolphins is that we humans have big brains compared to a lot of other species. And it's those big brains that we sort of understand underlie our ability to manipulate our environment in really creative ways and to get the most out of the environment. So if we have a big brain and we're doing that, any other animal with a big brain should be doing the same thing. And this has sort of been attached to the whales and the dolphins because they do have large brains. Some of them have the largest brains on the planet. This is the sperm whale and the killer whale. They have brains up to about 8 kilograms, which is 5 to 6 times larger than what ours are. So if they have such a big brain and the brains are for doing things with, they must be really intelligent. That's sort of the bottom line. But you can counter that sort of logic very, very easily. So we know that our hand is very manually dexterous, okay? We can do things with our hands and we can manipulate our environment with that. The same structure in the whale or dolphin is their flipper. Their flippers are very large. Some of the big whales can have flippers that weigh hundreds of kilograms. Does that mean they're very manually dexterous? And the answer really is quite simply, no, they're not, because their flipper is built in a very different way to the way our hand is built. And when we accept that the whale and dolphin brain is built in a very different way to the human brain, that argument that size alone matters starts to fall apart.
Yeah. So in comparing the brain structures of cetaceans and their closest land relatives like camels and hippos, why do people deduce that there's, kind of a quantum leap in intelligence? And do you think there was when these mammals transitioned to aquatic life? So I like to think that, seals are basically dogs. Their closest land relatives are dogs, if you consider seals land relatives. And if you go back, I think they have whales are not related to hippos per se, but whales and hippos have a common ancestor. And so at some point there was a divergence. Fish were in the sea. Whales had some proto whale that was on land that went into the sea. Is that correct?
That's correct. There was sort of an amphibious stage in the evolution of whales and dolphins. And that was, I think, about 50 to 55 million years ago. There was an amphibious phase. Then, well, maybe even earlier than that. Then probably around 50 million years ago, these animals became truly aquatic and they were in the water all the time. This is this ancient group of cetaceans that are called the Archaeoceti.
Mhm.
And what's interesting, these animals could be very, very large in the water, but they actually had very small brains, not only relative to their body size, but in total. So, for example, a 14-meter archaeocete, that would be here, I think you're pointing to ambulocetus, for example. These groups there, yes. The Pakicetus was the amphibious one. And then as you go down, the ambulocetus, Cuchacetus, and down to the Durodon, these animals could be 14 meters long, but their brains were actually quite small. They, for example, had a cerebral cortex with a surface area of about 25 centimeters squared. So that's 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, which is quite small. But then the modern whales and dolphins can have up to 3,000 square centimeters of cortex. So there's quite a big difference. So these animals were living in the water for about 20 to 25 million years before the large-brained whales and dolphins that we call the Neoceti. Instead of the ancient Archaeoceti is the ancient whales and dolphins, the Neoceti is the modern whales and dolphins. They evolved about 32 million years ago, and that's when the large brains came about. So the whales and dolphins were in water for many millions of years prior to getting a large brain. So it's not the movement to the ocean that led to the large brains of modern whales and dolphins. So that's one thing to clear up a little bit. Does that make sense to you?
Was it a migratory pattern then? I mean, my feeling is that life, grew mostly around the tropics. I mean, we are probably littoral naked apes, from the tropical West Africa and migrated out. I imagine that most life started in tropical regions rather than freezing ones. And so there must have been a migration to kind of fill the voids. People travel around, the Vikings, make their trips north and out to Greenland, on a human basis. And probably other animals and species do the same. They migrated from the genesis of life, which is it going to be incubated in warm water, say, out.
Right.
And so is there any kind of indication of migratory patterns that might have coincided with larger brains?
You're very close to the mark there. Excuse me. Most of the Archaeoceti, the ancient cetaceans, lived around an equatorial sea. So at the time they were around, there was an equatorial sea called the Tethys Sea. And it was quite a warm, shallow, nutrient-rich ocean. Around 32 million years ago, India crashed into Asia, Africa and the Mediterranean, Africa and Europe got closer together, and North and South America got quite close together. This got rid of this whole warm equatorial Tethys Sea, and the whales and dolphins were pushed into much colder water. And at the same time, there was a major drop in the global temperatures. So ocean waters dropped by about 6 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 10 degrees Fahrenheit.
And that's because of all the humans burning coal, correct?
No, this was 30 million years ago. Unfortunately, we weren't doing that then. We weren't even around then. So they got sort of kicked out of their very warm, shallow, nutrient-rich environment into these large, cold oceans. And this is when the large brains also evolved. So there's different ideas about it. My idea is about the thermogenesis is the reason for the large brain evolving. Other people say, well, they had to adapt to new environments, and so they needed more intelligence to adapt to new environments.
Yeah.
So there's two opposing arguments. There's a physical one versus an argument saying they needed more cognitive tools to survive. But we can't really get that down to any numbers or facts and figures.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've done my share of snorkeling, so I'm an expert.
Okay.
So when you're gliding around the water, I frankly think that the tropical world is a more target-rich environment. There are more other animals around. There are more threats. The coloration, the type of spikes, and the objects around seem to be far more plentiful in number than they would be in Arctic waters. And so, if anything, I think you'd need to be more wary and intelligent to be navigating the tropics when there's so many more other threats. I mean, maybe it could be that. And plus, the whales, the cetaceans, whales, dolphins, whatever, they're large. I mean, I don't know when they got the size thing, but they're large animals, so not many are going to be attacking them. So it seems to me that if you need a brain, a large brain to do our major functions are reproduction and food, but you can't do reproduction unless you get food. So it's important to stay alive and it's important to catch things. And there's two basic types of ways of catching food. There's the kind of passive one of the herbivores, so they kind of sit around and munch all day. Kind of your deer, cattle and whatnot. They're grazing, and their eyes are on the side of their head, so they're looking out for predators. And then there are predators, which I think would have to be a little bit, on average, smarter, because food's not plentiful, and they have to go catch it. So they have their eyes ahead of them. So the cetaceans, I mean, I gather whale eat a lot of kelp and whatnot, so they seem to be more like, aquatic cattle. You tell me. And I imagine they're also killer whales. So I'm curious about the eye placement as far as that goes, whether they work on their vision and whatnot, and whether they need their brains to do complicated tasks, and or whether the herbivore whales have different brain size from the carnivore whales.
They do indeed, actually. So you're hitting on some very interesting points there. The first is the warm tropical oceans have more information in them. And when there's more information, being other animals and surfaces and plants and things, you do need to actually pay attention to them to get around. When you're out in the cooler, larger open ocean, there's much less information there in terms of what you need to get to. But then when you have the baleen or filter feeding whales, these are the ones that eat a lot of kelp and not kelp, krill.
Thank you. Yeah, my mistake.
Krill. Yeah. They're really just sort of opening their mouths and moving through, and it's
kind of like being at a buffet,
right? But they don't echolocate. So the predatory type sedations, like the dolphins or the killer whales, have echolocation, or the sperm whales. They echolocate, and so by using echolocation, they don't need to have their eyes in front of them. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
So
they have stereoscopic vision, as it were, but it's not. Right. It's frankly, vision per se is not that effective underwater, because you can only see a certain distance. You're looking for sonar.
They don't have stereoscopic vision.
Yeah, but they probably have stereoscopic sonar.
Sonar. So sonar, yes, they can use that quite a bit. But in terms of vision, using their eyes, their eyesight's quite poor. It's about a tenth of the quality of our eyesight. And then when you put that underwater, that makes it even worse.
Right. I mean, so in general, it's not going to be that. I mean, eyes are cool, but they're not that effective to be that guy. That's taken in the ocean.
Right. So the predatory dolphins and whales are using echolocation in order to find their food, and that's actually quite a good. It's a great adaptation in an open environment, because you echolocate out and there's not many surfaces to bounce back the echo from. It's only going to, when it hits something of importance, that the echo will be bounced back. If you're in a shallow environment that's full of all these different animals and other information, you're going to get so many echoes, it's going to become quite confusing.
Right.
Although bats manage it with tiny little brains. So I don't think echolocation is that incredibly complex. You would need to evolve a huge brain for it, because microbats do that as well. But it is still a very handy adaptation to living in an open ocean environment.
Right. So I believe, I'm not sure it's been termed this per se, but I believe in kind of biologic parsimony, frugality, and that is to say that animals just kind of keep enough things that they need to do their thing. And so moles don't really have much in the way of vision, and sloths, hang out on the top of trees. They don't need to be running around that much. So the animals pretty much pick their lane on the road, and they're gonna just do that thing. So Horses don't need a big protective coat of armor because they're big and they're going to stomp on you. Elephants don't need to be fast because nobody can, if you do catch an elephant, what are you going to do? So that they are the thing they are. Hippopotamus needs a big coat of fat because he's sitting in the water all day.
Right.
I think we have shed our hair versus the other primates because we were in and out of the water a lot, so we needed to cool down. Anyway, my point is that you can't do everything. Obviously, we have managed to do things. We've learned how to fly. We can create an exoskeleton. We can do lots of things, but those are artificial. But as far as your own personal body space, as it were, anyway, so biologic parsimony, you kind of get the cards you need to play with. You're not going to get every card in the deck and be able to play every single hand possible. So here we have the whales, and they're running around in the Arctic Ocean or whatever cold places and so forth. Your theory is that their brains stayed their brains, but they adapted in a certain way by size to deal with the cold. And I'm just going to squeeze in a quick anecdote here. I mentioned it earlier, but I went at one point. It was a hot day, but I didn't realize it was freezing water, and I dived off a boat to avoid having to take a little dinghy launch back and forth. It was taking too much time. I was going to save time, and I went in the water, and in Fahrenheit it was 51 degrees. I didn't know it, and I had intended to swim 100 yards or so, and I wound up bailing out, going like 20 yards to the side because my brain started to freeze, and it wasn't freezing water. It's really quick how I was not really able to coordinate my muscles. I was like having a struggle just to move and deal with it. And it was a panic for me. And I remember vividly, whales, when you want to get warm, we shiver. So we shiver, we get warmth. And as naked apes, we didn't have to do much of that because we were in tropical areas. And frankly, we go vacation there all the time because I think there's some instinctual basis to lie out on the beach and eat shellfish and whatnot. So I was trying to swim as hard as I can. I couldn't maintain my own body heat in a matter of minutes. Now, if you're just sitting in this cold water all the time, and Arctic saline water is below 0 degrees Celsius, below 32 degrees potentially. Biologic function doesn't go on. They have to be well insulated to begin with. That's the blubber and whatnot. But carry on. Maybe tell us a little bit about your thoughts.
Well, there's some really interesting things coming with heat generation, and I think, in essence, adapting to that loss of heat in water has driven what we see as modern whales and dolphins. I think that's the crucial point. So they have a very modified vascular system. So, for example, whales and dolphins don't have carotid arteries. All their blood goes into their brain and out of their brain through their vertebral arteries. And so that's an unusual kind of thing. The second thing, all that blubber, it's not just blubber. There's actually layers of brown fat inside that blubber. And that brown fat has a lot of what we call uncoupling proteins. The uncoupling proteins short circuit the ATP cycle in the cell and release all the energy as heat. Okay, so they more or less have an electric blanket, as a metaphor, around them while they're swimming in the water. But then the brain, one of the things a lot of people don't know is the brain produces its own heat independent of the body. Okay, so in all mammals that happens. It's a thing about mammals and birds that are different to other animals. So no one really knows how this is produced. So I thought, well, maybe it's like brown fat. It should be non-shivering thermogenesis. So I started to look for uncoupling proteins in the brains of whales and dolphins and compare them to their close relatives. And what we found was that most of the neurons in the whale and dolphin brain, as well as a lot of the glia, the support cells in the whale and dolphin brain, have these uncoupling proteins in them. And this is quite unusual. We're talking about 80 to 90% of the cells within the brains of whales and dolphins have this uncoupling protein, Whereas when you look at the other animals, you're looking at about 20 to 30% of the neurons have uncoupling protein in them. So it's quite a bit different. Yeah, this is the graph from the recent paper showing that. And you can see maybe the two thick black bars are probably the best.
Yeah, here's the one. Are these the artiodactyls?
That's the average for the artiodactyls, which are the closest relatives of the whales and dolphins.
Land-based.
That's the average for the whales and dolphins there, yeah. So you can see percentage-wise, around 90% of the neurons have this uncoupling protein in it. When you have the uncoupling protein there, you can short-circuit the ATP cycle and produce heat through non-shivering thermogenesis. If we don't have the brain producing its own heat and keeping warm, the neurons won't work. As soon as we drop down 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, the neurons in the brain start to stop working. And that's why you were freezing up when you were swimming. So you need to actually produce a lot of heat to keep the brain warm enough so that the neurons that you do have there maintain their function. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, of course it does. The example I used earlier with you is, my tenants, their pipes froze. They freeze maybe once every other year or so. It gets cold enough. It's in Fahrenheit, it's like -15, -20 degrees, whatever, or -5, I guess. It gets below zero here, and the copper pipes freeze in the basement. And so we have, wrapped, like you say, the electric blanket. We have tools. We insulate them, and then we also have active wires that warm the pipes to prevent this from happening. So you basically need all your stuff to be functioning, and you're sitting in cold water. There's no respite. Even if you breach as a whale, which you have to do every couple of minutes, you're going outside. It's actually probably even colder above the water than it is. Plus you have so it's not like they're going to have any break for potentially months at a time.
Oh, lifetimes. One of the thing, we lose heat to the water 90 times faster than we lose heat to the air. So if you're standing in your bathing suit in 10 degree Celsius air, or I forget what that is in Fahrenheit. Right. Sorry,
that's like 50. That's kind of like the water I was swimming in. That was like 50, for me. Yeah. It was freezing.
Right. So if you're standing in the air at that temperature, you can stand it for quite a while. But if you're in the water in that temperature, you're going to get cold very.
Right now, literally, it's 10 degrees Celsius outside, and I walked around. I walked the dog and all that kind of stuff this morning. All kinds of stuff. It was fine. I mean, I had no issue. Plus, I'm wearing clothing and so forth. But if I were in that same 10-degree water, that was my episode. I was telling you when I was going nuts after about 5-10 seconds. I was just kind of.
So in order to live in that temperature, kind of that sort of water temperature, even though some of the oceans get warmer than that, some of them get quite cold, quite cooler. You need to have a special suite of biological adaptations to manage that, and it's all around heat. And so the interesting thing is when you start to look at the whales and dolphins, you see that their distributions in the ocean match temperature gradients. So they're not moving north-south; they're actually east-west temperature gradients. So the distribution of the animals matches the temperatures very, very nicely. And then their brains became large at the transition from the Archaeoceti to the Neoceti, when they went from the warm ocean into the larger, colder ocean that had a significant drop in temperature. And so at these times, they had to evolve something to stay alive. And by increasing your brain by quite a bit, you can actually create a lot of heat in that brain. Now, people have said, is the brain in whales and dolphins actually warming up their whole body? I don't think it's really doing that. Although we know in humans, for example, the jugular venous blood is 0.3 degrees warmer than the internal carotid blood. So the blood does get warmed up in the brain, but is it enough to warm up an entire whale or dolphin with their brains? I don't think so. I don't think it's hitting that. I think the adaptation is more to keep the brain functional that they have, you know. And there are some fascinating things about whale and dolphin brains that have nothing to do with intelligence. You know, they sleep with half their brain at a time. That's one of the other amazing things. You know, when you're in the water permanently, you still have to sleep. You're a mammal, you need to sleep. So they sleep with the left half of their brain for an hour or 45 minutes, swaps over to the right half of the brain for 45 minutes, backwards and forwards. And each half of the brain, say in dolphins, gets about 4 hours of sleep each night. But one of the really cool things is they don't go into REM sleep. So whales and dolphins don't have any REM sleep. So we call it unihemispheric slow wave sleep, and they don't have any REM sleep at all, or dreaming sleep, as people think about it, which is a really interesting thing given what we know about the effects of dreaming sleep and how necessary it is for us.
Well, are we making a mistake of anthropomorphizing, REM sleep? I mean, is this one of these,
possibly, yeah,
post hoc ergo propter hoc kind of fallacies? I mean, we dream, we're smart, we dream more, we have more creative concepts, we feel rested, right, alert, and so forth. Is it right or wrong to impute that to dolphins and whales? They're not dreaming.
Well, they don't have the REM sleep,
right?
And we know from studying other animals they do have dreams. Your dog, for example, you can probably see when it's chasing a rabbit or something.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah.
They go,
right.
Running his sleep, and
right. They definitely have content in their dreams, just like we do. I mean, I don't think that's anthropomorphizing. I think that's
so. Do you think? Yeah, fair enough. It's mammal morphizing. Do you think that dolphins and whales have dreams at all? If there's no REM sleep?
Well, during slow wave sleep, we also have very simple dreams. So, for example, if you're in non-REM sleep or slow wave sleep, and I wake you and ask you what you were dreaming about, you might say, well, I was dreaming about the color blue. So it'll be very simple. If I wake you from REM sleep, I was in an elevator, I was jumping from this to that and the other, and it's a much more complex narrative that often has a lot to do with emotions. So my personal view is that the REM sleep is all about resetting our limbic system, our emotional system. And one of the interesting things about whale and dolphin brains is they actually have a very relatively small limbic system. So their potential for emotion in a relative sense appears less than what it does in a lot of other mammals.
Okay, so this is going to rub against people's perceptions.
Oh yes,
of the happy dolphin. I grew up watching TV show Flipper. And so therefore, dolphins are our friends and they understand us and they can do tasks. I mean, I also watched Lassie, which is a collie who, was able to rescue Timmy all the time, and all that kind of stuff. So some of it's, obviously fantasy.
In Australia, we had Skippy the kangaroo.
Yeah. So kangaroos are brilliant also, right?
Yeah. So no, look, yes, we have those things. They're culturally within us. And that's fine. But as a scientist, we have to let go of those things and, let go of all our very strongly held beliefs so we can look at things with a very clear mind.
So let's try to be scientific about this. In science, we try to do kind of black box experiments to, take away your biases and just have things be the things they are without naming them. So if we made dolphins look like mice, or vice versa, we all made them into some bland black box, normal size animal. Let's go backwards from their behaviors and attributes and talk about whether they are ordinary or extraordinary in the context of what is trainable activity or behavior for, say, your random mammal X.
Okay, so let me give you a nice example with that. So I'm just going through my notes from some of the questions you gave to me earlier. So one of the things that's often talked about with whales and dolphins is their ability to detect numbers. They talk about numerosity. And this is a common thing across a lot of behavioral studies. So whales and dolphins can tell the difference between few and many. Most animals can tell the difference between few and many. If you offer animals, 15 treats as opposed to 5, and they have the choice to walk to one or the other, they'll go to the 15. Most will do that. So in some behavioral tests, people were studying using the visual system in the whales and dolphins. They were putting up dots, and if they went to the many, they would reward the animal with a fish. So it took the whales and dolphins about 260 trials to learn that. So it took a while before they learnt, okay, I go to the one with more dots on it, I press the paddle or nudge, put my nose against it, then I get a treat. It took them about 400 trials to learn that that's the rule and that's what they got to do. Sorry, 260 trials, my mistake, 260 trials. Then one of the things you can do to test the cognitive abilities of animals is reverse the rule. So instead, when they go to the more and they press that button or do whatever action is required there, they don't get rewarded. They only get rewarded if they go to the fewer, which they didn't get rewarded to before. Mm-hmm. We call that reversal learning. So it took them 260 trials to learn the rule first, and then 240 trials to unlearn that rule and learn a new one. Okay, so if we look at seals, seals learnt the task in 400 trials, but it only took them 100 trials to reverse that learning. So there's a bit of a difference. With the whales and dolphins, it looked like they were relearning the whole thing again. Whereas the seals, because they did it so much faster, then they clearly had the concept, oh, that's one rule, now I've got to change to another rule. Similar pattern, but it's a different thing. For the whales and dolphins, it was like, oh, new thing. So it's a little bit different there.
Right. So every day, there's a joke about Alzheimer's that the beauty is that every day is fresh.
Right. And so for them, it was like things were fresh. But as I say, there are special things in their brains. One of them is the way they sleep with half their brain at a time. And all the sleep systems in their brain are modified to accommodate for that. And that's really quite interesting on its own. The other special thing about their brain is to do with vocalizations. So in their brainstem, an area called the periaqueductal gray, which as a medic, I hope you know about, in the pontine region of their brain, they have a very specialized nucleus that's the pattern generator for vocalizations. But it's in the brainstem. It's not in the cerebral cortex. So it's not from a part where we normally find in other animals, this is the part of the brain that's doing the thinking. It's right down in the more reflexive parts of the brain, we could say, or the more learned motor patterns that are happening there. Yeah. And so there are these very interesting things about whales and dolphin brains, but they're not things that point to the idea that they're more intelligent than any other mammal. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that dolphins and whales are less intelligent than other mammals. I think they're just an average kind of mammal in that sense. Mm-hmm. But also their evolutionary history, their life in water, has meant that there's some things that they just haven't been exposed to. And so they don't pick up things. Mm-hmm. For example, nets. I think I emailed you a picture of some captive dolphins from the book by John Lilly.
Yeah.
And he was saying they were jumping and looking down in a box looking for other dolphins, yet these dolphins wouldn't jump over a net to go back to their home Bay of Florida, which seems a little unusual to me, mm-hmm. And the interpretation of that is, it's one of these, it's a very nice example of that the two different ways of looking at the whales and dolphins. In one, he caught these wild dolphins, put them in a net. The net doesn't go any higher than the top of the water. He took some of the dolphins out and had them in a box, and the dolphins were jumping in the air. And he was saying they were jumping, trying to look down to where their friends were. But my question is then, if they can jump in the air and know that someone's elsewhere, why don't they jump the net and escape back to their natural habitat?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing most animals do. You put them into a container, they look for a way out.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's so funny. Yeah, I'm going to detour slightly because there's a Jerry Seinfeld story. He says, the people, there are these skyscrapers with mirrored windows, and the birds hit those and they fall down. They build these skyscrapers and there's dead birds on the street. This is a thing. And so he says, no, I get it. He says, you're a bird, you're flying along and you see this thing, it's mirrored, so it looks like sky. I get it. So you're going to keep flying, right? And it looks the same as it's behind you. He says, but so the Seinfeld joke is, says, I get that part, but wouldn't you want to avoid the bird that's coming right at you?
Right.
Well, I mean, they actually can't probably because they have their eyes, a lot of them on the side. But I think you're making a reasonable point by analogy, which is that there are certainly crafty animals and they figure stuff out. I mean, raccoons, I think, are quite intelligent. They figure out how to get in and out of stuff, and they adapt to all kinds of terrains. They are willing to get food from the wild, but if there's food that you happen to have in a garbage can or in your house or whatever, they're going to deal with that.
Deal with that first.
I kind of find them, humanish, with their hands and their eyes straight ahead of them, so forth. I think those are kind of smart animals. Do we have any kind of raccoonish kind of behavior adaptations that dolphins are able to do in any of their circumstances? And I don't know, whatever, all these aquatic parks and whatnot.
There are reports of dolphins and humans fishing together in different places, but whether that's sort of advantageous or not, whether those instances are anecdotes that haven't been properly tested, and so it's very difficult to say too much about them without sort of putting some value judgment on it. Yeah, it's quite a weird thing. Yeah. So, but even using tools and those kind of things, they're very common across animal species. Crabs use tools.
But it'd be hard for dolphins to use tools very much. I mean,
there's one report where it's believed that they use sea sponges as tools to protect their noses while they're looking for fish that have a particularly nasty sting. But then it's passed down only to the female young and not to the male young. So it's a little bit, the data is there, but it's how you interpret it that's very difficult.
But how do they place things? I mean, they got their mouth.
It's a sea sponge, and they just sort of shove their nose into it and swim along with it, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
So whether that's tool use or not, as opposed to a crab that picks up two sea anemones and uses them to sting other animals with to eat, that's a clear example of tool use.
Yeah, I know this. I mean, lately, I guess I've become much more kind of a naturalist. I look and observe a lot of animal life just in my leafy suburb here, and there's a lot of interesting behavior that insects do. I mean, they're crafty, and a lot of the fish can make interesting patterns, and there's just a fair amount of again, probably unidirectional behavior that they can be brilliant at. Far in excess of what we are capable of doing, the attention and devotion and so forth to task. I mean, you would love if your football team could keep up with ants or wasps or bees in their kind of focus on teamwork and so forth. And it's very anyway. So they exceed us in many different ways. We tend to have kind of a more pluripotential omnifocus than they do, and we're able to be adaptive. Anyway, so I you mentioned who was it, Lily?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about this book. It's 1969, Man and Dolphin.
Yeah.
Nancy Lilly, an MD. You got to watch out for those medical doctors. The true brilliant story of a man's experiments in talking with dolphins. And the book that made The Day of the Dolphin a bestseller, man's newest greatest adventure. Tell us a little about Dr. Lilly.
So Lilly was a neurophysiologist, and as far as I remember, he did a lot of experiments on whales and dolphins, and he was in that time when putting electrodes in the brains was a big deal. So he was trying to record from the brains of whales and dolphins and putting electrodes into their brains. One of the difficult things, though, is to anesthetize whales and dolphins is very hard. He was mainly working on dolphins. I think he killed, dozens of the animals trying to figure out the anesthesia, which he never got right. It's one of the very difficult things with whales and dolphins is to anesthetize them. He then was part of the LSD tune in, drop out. Was it tune in, turn on, and drop out movement?
Yep.
And I think somewhere along the line, some of that had some ill effect on him. I don't know for sure, but I believe he tried giving LSD to whales and dolphins while he was taking it, in the idea that they could actually then communicate and so on. His whole idea was built around the logic that they have a big brain, it's bigger than ours, therefore they must be doing more with their brain than what we're doing. And we've just got to figure out how to communicate with them. And that was really as far as it went. I don't think he very much popularized the idea of smart dolphins, and that came along with Flipper and other things like that. But I don't think he really added much in terms of science to understanding whales and dolphins.
So kind of getting back to the science part, how is your work viewed, and has the narrative moved at all? It's very hard for me. When I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, I didn't have your name, and I guess I didn't pursue it deeply enough, using only my hippopotamus brain. But it doesn't seem that if you Google are dolphins all that smart? Is there whale intelligence exaggerated? There's nothing. You get nothing on the internet. So our communal brain, which is kind of mapped out, let's say, by Google, Internet, AI, whatever. It seems to be that you're wrong.
That would be the general conclusion. Yeah.
So is there a movement to kind of recategorize this? I mean, people are interested in thermogenesis. There are people trying to make obesity medications and so forth based on thermogenesis. Brown fat, which, by the way, for people out there, is supposedly your hibernation fat. Bears have when they're hibernating, they use their brown fat to just sit there motionless and stay warm. So this is always a fight to live, and so it's basically just like if you stick if you get literally a short circuit and put it into an outlet, you'll get a spark, you'll get heat, because electricity just traveling around is going to with very little resistance is going to create heat. So what's going? I mean, it would seem to me that this would be a topical matter if in fact we could parlay some of the uncoupling protein aspects that the whales might have, and see it as an interesting thing in and of itself, that they're able to do thermogenesis in their brain.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting thing. It's one of the difficulties that people have with accepting the idea I put forward, is it says that a big brain can evolve for a reason other than intelligence. We don't necessarily have to evolve a big brain for intelligence. It's logical. Big things can get big for different reasons.
Right.
But we're so stuck on the idea that a large brain is for intelligence, that people don't want to let it go.
Right.
Amongst the scientific community, amongst the people that I work with and that are in my sort of field of study, most of them are reasonably accepting of the idea that whales and dolphins are not that bright. No, I wouldn't say not that bright. I would say that they're nothing special compared to other.
They're not stellar.
Yeah, there's nothing there that jumps out and says this is amazing about them. The amazing things about sleep and other things like that. But most of the people are sort of accepting of the idea, and they're fully supportive of the idea. Whereas the people that tend to disagree with it are those that have a vested career and financial interest in the idea of whales and dolphins being somehow very smart. People who invested their careers into it, they get their grants based on the idea that whales and dolphins are smart and so on. So they have a sort of maybe an inbuilt bias against what I'm saying, right. and they've certainly made their feelings known quite dramatically. Is sort of citing my name in the titles of their papers and that sort of thing, and some of them have been quite rude at conferences. Some have cried and told me that I'll be the death of all whales and dolphins around the world. I've had letters written to the university insisting that I be sacked and all this sort of thing. So there has been some kickback from it, but nothing too bad, nothing that I'm too worried about, to be honest.
So
the guy Paul Watson, was he the sea pirate guy? What's his name? Captain Paul Watson. I forget his name now. He was the one who would go around and harass the whalers in the Arctic Ocean. He wasn't from Greenpeace. What was Sea Shepherd? The Sea Shepherd guy. He wrote a bit entitled "Dolphins are dumb, scientists is dumber," and then just proceeded on a tirade. And like, that's fine, It's a scientific idea. It's out there. It gives a very valid alternative and a good reason as to why they might have large brains and why we don't see anything amazing with their intelligence.
Yeah,
and so it gives an alternative idea.
Getting back to the parsimony thing, I just don't think they have to be that intelligent to survive. Clearly, they survive. They're enormous, and they have that. Like elephants are enormous, and they don't have to be hugely bright. I'm not saying they're stupid, but they can do things that whales can do, I assume. I don't know. I assume elephants are equally trainable and whatnot, and you can find elephants doing all kinds of interesting things. And they are enormous. They don't have to be fast. They don't have to be, super violent. They don't have to be threatening. They don't have to learn a lot of actions because they're kind of trundling along being elephants. And ditto's whales, and whales, frankly, I think have a much more benign environment running around the Arctic when I don't think they have any natural threats, do they?
Not in the colder waters, I wouldn't think so. When they start to get
cold, aside from the cold water itself, it seems to me that is a major threat, and that threat would not be dealt with intellectually. That would be dealt with engineeringly, structurally, and that's where you should be designing. So we're going to be rounding out the hour soon, and I didn't get to every question I would have, but on a getting to structural, nuts and bolts and whatnot, we don't think with our entire brain. Amazingly enough, we have this big brain. We don't think with a lot of it. A lot of it's just there to kind of keep you happy and alert and awake through the night. Remembering to breathe. Having your food move around. Keeping warm. There's just a lot of kind of status quo management aspects. If you run a smart home, you realize there are a lot of things going on. Your refrigerator turns on and off. Have to keep the doors. You have security. Cold, the temperature, blah, blah, blah. You have to have your oil and furnace work. Anyway, a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of it's just kind of managerial. We actually think we have a left brain and a right brain. And probably for most of us, we're just thinking with the dominant side. The other side is mostly duplicative and make sure that we're not asymmetric in our actions. We're going to run and make sure that the left leg, moves along with the right leg and whatnot. But on this basis, so when you get down to brass tacks, we don't think with all of our brain. We think with a small portion of it. We think with the cortical, part of our brain, midbrain, kind of structurally central, and only with the gray matter, as it were. And so that's the neurons and whatnot. The white matter is pretty much the pathway between different functions. It's kind of the trucking system to get, you might want something from Amazon today. It's sitting in Indianapolis and has to get to you. So, so the actual useful bit in the computer sense, the information bit, is that item. So I need let's say drill bits, to use a pun. I want them, I see them, I need them, I get them, and it's being transported. So most of the time, an effort with that is to get it from A to B. And so, so there's the white matter, which is the glial part and whatnot. What is the ratio of white matter to gray matter in, say, your primate versus your cetacean brain?
Well, off the top of my head, I don't know, but I believe they scale reasonably similarly across most mammals. I do know the elephant fits exactly on a scale of where things are. But in terms of the whales and dolphins and their cortex, so the cortex, the thinking part, the density of neurons is much lower than what you find in other animals. And they also have a much higher density of glia. And these neurons and glia in the whales and dolphins have a lot of uncoupling protein in it that we don't find in other mammals. Plus, the individual neurons themselves, their dendrites are shorter and less branched than what you see in other animals, and especially in primates and elephants. And so the ability for sort of local information processing happening in neurons seems to be weaker in the whales and dolphins. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying it's not as well expressed as what we see in others. So we have a lower density of neurons and a weaker kind of processing. And we have those neurons chemically capable of creating heat, which we don't see so often in the other animals. So, then the hippocampus is another interesting.
Slightly. I mean, it's analogous to your point. It's not identical. This is going to be a hard slide for people at home to see. I apologize, but basically, this is I assume
it's a plot of brain size against the size of the hippocampus, which is the hippocampus is the part of our brain involved in memory and navigation. And the hippocampus works a lot with the prefrontal cortex when we're thinking and doing things. So it's recalling memories backwards and forwards of the prefrontal cortex to do things. So we found in the whales and dolphins, they actually have very small hippocampi.
Yeah, so they're the red dots over here.
The red dots there, yeah.
So I just to kind of put this in scale.
There's a human above it there, yeah.
That's you and me. We're right in here someplace.
Right. So the size of their hippocampus is very, very small. Their prefrontal cortex, which is our frontal lobe, where all the executive functions occur in humans, is also very small. So in terms of doing what they do in a way that we would do it, their brain is either working in a completely different way, or it doesn't have the same functions, or it has the same functions. They're just very reduced in their complexity. So there's many, many features about the whale and dolphin brains that indicate the functions are there, but the complexity of the functions is much lower than what you would find in terrestrial mammals.
Fair enough. So, people, I'm going to maybe let you have concluding statements and also talk about either zebras or zebras at the end, and how people can follow you and whatnot. I've thought of whales and dolphins as kind of cattle of the sea, but is that fair? I mean, and conversely, I mean, I gather they're close, more, if you kind of go back, our modern day whale relatives would be camels and hippopotami. Is that right? I mean, and how different is that from, say, cattle and whatnot? And then so this follow-up question would be, do those land-based animals have kind of this communication thing? We all hear about the whale songs and whatnot. What's up with the whale songs? Do other animals have things like that? Do they need them? Do they want them? And how do you convince people who love whale songs that it's not a Mozart?
Okay, so whale song, that's more, as far as I'm aware, that happens mostly in the very large baleen whales. It doesn't happen in the smaller animals. The whale song, I believe, is a mating call, a series of mating calls, and I haven't looked into that in a lot of detail. But if you look at, say, the dolphins, for example, they're meant to communicate while they're hunting, and to sort of, so they can cooperatively hunt. They're communicating through calls. What's interesting is the whales and dolphins have about, well, the dolphins have about 7 species typical calls. So 7 species typical sounds that they make, or calls. Of those 7 sounds, one of them is what they call their signature whistle, like their name. Mm. The wild dolphins, every second sound they make on average is their name. And then they have 6 other sounds to communicate things with.
Randy.
Right.
Randy.
And so it gets difficult to understand how they can use that to get across complex communications. Whereas we have other animals like, I don't know if you know about fruit bats.
Yes.
You know about the fruit bats. They have 35 different calls that they use in a range of different situations.
Right.
So I'm not convinced that they really have some sort of particularly strong vocal ability to communicate complex thoughts between each other. And as I said earlier, part of their specialization of their brain is in the brainstem, which is the pattern generator for vocalizations. That's specialized in their brainstem. Elephants have the same thing, and so do elephant seals. And these are all animals that have specialized vocalizations, but are they using them for communication if the brainstem is what's really driving these things? Yeah. And so perhaps they don't really have any special vocalization. They may have enough. Well, they have enough to do what they need to do, but then there's a lot of animals that will hunt cooperatively without vocalizations and do it by vision. For lions, for example.
All right. So next you're going to tell me that Mickey Mouse can't really sing and talk.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's something that's made up. Yeah.
So I'm going to give you a minute to close and tell us anything you want to, and then I'm going to layer on top of that just with a self-promotion.
Okay. So I think the thing that I'd really like to get across is that there are alternative ways about thinking of these things. We don't need to be stuck in one way of thinking. We should actually look at different ways of thinking about how brains work and how they function in different animals. I think it's really important to understand the different animals. We're going through a major extinction of mammals or animals across the planet, and we're going to lose a lot of these animals unless we start to really understand them and understand them for what they are and not what we want to think that they are. I think that's the really important thing. So we have to take a step back from our own emotional feelings and attachments and say, what's really the truth there? If, for example, I've made this argument before with people that work on whales and dolphins, if 100,000 or more dolphins are being killed every year in tuna nets, can we actually solve that problem? If we accept the whales and dolphins aren't that intelligent, then we can start to look, or they don't have a special intelligence, then we can start to look at them and say, what can we do to stop that? So if we look at the tuna, they swim between 15 and 50 meters below the surface of the water. If the whales and dolphins have to come up to breathe, If we took away the top 10 meters of netting, then the animals would be able to escape quite easily. But we have to accept that they're not, they don't have the cognitive capacity to come up and jump over the nets and escape. They have to have an opening under the water. You might lose a few tuna and you still might catch a few dolphin, but the amount of tuna you lose and the amount of dolphins you won't kill would be worthwhile. And doing that kind of experiment by just seeing if you set a net, because what they set the tuna nets around the dolphins when they're feeding, then they get in the water and they lift the dolphins out over the nets. That's if they're being kind. Most of the time they just throw the dolphins, overboard once they pulled them on board. But if they had 10 meters or so where they could easily swim out, we could actually save hundreds of thousands of dolphins by just accepting them for what they actually are and not what we want to think that they are.
Yeah, that's a funny thing. Well, I appreciate that. Can people follow you or help contribute to any of your causes? And just tell us briefly what the zebra.
Okay. Well, I'm a little weird. I don't own a cell phone, and I don't do social media. So I'm a little bit old-fashioned in that sense. But we are starting a project based on zebras trying to save the African savanna ecosystem. This is about 5% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. And the zebra are the key animal for this. So the zebras have the largest hippocampus of all mammals. And one of the jobs of the hippocampus is for navigation, spatial navigation. So we've worked out that the zebras are the animals that actually lead the migrations around the African savanna. We know currently of about 4 or 5 of these migrations, but in the distributions of zebras, there's space for about 50 migrations, large migrations on the African savanna. If we find all those out, we can kind of work this ecosystem out like a patchwork quilt and say, here are the areas we need to conserve. And like all ecosystems, the African savanna is under threat from several different ways. One, the population in sub-Saharan Africa should be about 2 billion by 2050. So there's a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of agriculture and movements around there. But the biggest threat is mining. So the African savanna ecosystem is full of lithium. And lithium is very important for the green revolution. However, if we dig up the African savanna ecosystem, about 100 gigatons of carbon are going to go into the atmosphere, and that's going to accelerate climate change and global warming. So the green revolution could also be problematic. So we need to understand how this ecosystem works based on understanding the zebra prior to mining it, so we can actually do that responsibly. We can conserve the last megafauna on the planet, or mammalian megafauna on the planet, and actually put things together in a much better way. But I can send you our little brief of the zebra project so you can have a look at it. We're trying to raise $60 million in order to do this work, because that's what we need to get the job done and get it done properly. And it might sound like a lot of money, but for saving 5% of the land surface, I think it's kind of a bargain in a way. And the cool thing is the zebra is the animal that's going to allow us to do that.
Well, I appreciate that. That's lovely. Thank you so much for this, and thank you for your time. Before we end, I'm going to pop in my self-promotion. I have a book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was, unrelated topic, except insofar as that it's something that people believe in very thoroughly, and they have invested in it, especially in the research establishment. People who are getting paid to kind of carry on this theory that Zika, which is a real virus, caused microcephaly, which is a real but separate problem, even though the data have not borne that ever since the 2015 pandemic in Brazil. The mosquito here is actually, people think there's a picture of me, but it's actually Aedes aegypti mosquito, because it does have my name under it. They believe that that despite the very lean, the absence of any predictive correlation of their original hypothesis with facts, that this is going to come back somehow in some way. Once there were investigations of Zika, and they had actually studies and tests, which they didn't have the original year, they didn't find any Zika around. They didn't find any Zika causing microcephaly. The places where people have been able to find Zika in advance of a potentially rush of Zika infection, they didn't find any microcephaly subsequently. So in 2018, Rajasthan, India, they were on the alert. They were monitoring for Zika. They had tests for Zika by then, which they didn't even have in Brazil at the time of the announced panic and pandemic. They didn't find any increase in microcephaly. So this is, Zika is basically the fifth dengue, and it's an issue in and of itself. But people are living under a fear and a false apprehension that a single mosquito bite can unalterably change the cherished life within an early pregnancy. Obviously, there are all kinds of other major problems on Earth, and I'm hoping that people will follow this one. Zika microcephaly will fade into memory and won't be an issue eventually. But right now, they're actually making a Zika vaccine, and they're injecting women in Baltimore, U.S., with Zika in hopes of getting one. And then they're going to have one, and somebody's going to make money making it and distributing it and so forth. But it's going to be diversion from genuine, regular medical problems like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV, and so forth. So all these things become diversionary and get people off track. And I think it's important that people understand the Zika microcephaly panic and pandemic to know that humans are fallible. We may not be as smart as whales and dolphins, but
we've got a lot of problems.
Yeah, but we make some mistakes. So
we create most of our own problems.
Yeah, this is. I don't know if you watch The Simpsons, but Homer Simpson said once about beer. Beer is the solution to beer is the creation of and solution to all of life's problems. So humans make the problems and then they get rid of them as well. And actually, the comedian Jon Stewart was talking about COVID, and he's got a same kind of quote that I put in a recent article in Brownstone, that science will, for COVID, science miraculously will have the cure that most likely science brought about for the problem that science brought about. Anyway, so Paul, I'm very much in debt for having been on my show. Thank you for engaging in my social media.
No problem.
And I look forward to engaging with you in the future.
All right. Cheers. Thanks for having me, Randall.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.